Steering my car through the ornate stone gates of the Arbor House estate on a warm, sunlit June afternoon, I felt a quiet, hopeful flutter in my chest that I hadn't experienced in many years. At 34 years old, as an ICU night shift nurse, accustomed to the stark, fluorescent reality of life and death hospital emergencies, I had carefully ironed my best pale blue dress at 6 that morning, determined to show up for my younger sister Chloe's wedding as her undeniable, loving sister. The golden sunlight dappled beautifully through the ancient oak trees, illuminating the elegant white arbor where well-dressed guests were lining up to sign the guest book. Walking up to the welcome table with a ribboned gift held gently in my arms, I smiled warmly at the venue coordinator, Bree Hartley, a sharp, kind woman with whom I had personally walked these exact garden grounds 13 months earlier when securing the reservation. "Wendy Myers," I said gently, giving my name with quiet pride and affection. But as Bree looked down at her official clipboard, her polished, professional smile instantly froze, and the healthy color drained completely from her face. Her eyes darted frantically between the printed paper and the thick, white legal folder tucked beneath her arm. "I'm so deeply sorry, Wendy," she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine pain and professional horror as a heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the queue behind me. "Your name was intentionally struck off the guest list this morning." I looked down at the upside-down clipboard and saw a fresh, decisive line of black ink slashed straight through my name. Before I could even process the sudden shock, my mother, Carol, appeared at my elbow, radiating the unhurried composure of a woman arriving at her own long-awaited coronation. Dressed in an exquisite champagne gown with baby's breath pinned delicately in her styled hair, she adjusted her posture and looked at me not as a daughter, but as an inconvenient ghost threatening her carefully constructed narrative. Raising her voice just enough to carry clearly to the silent line of church acquaintances waiting behind us, she offered a serene, practiced church smile. "Why would we invite someone who isn't really family?" she declared, her cruel words falling like ice onto the gravel. In that precise second, 12 long years of nocturnal sacrifices, secret bank transfers, and buried grievances crystallized into absolute, weightless clarity. I did not yell, cry, or cause a dramatic scene. Instead, I felt the calm, steady rhythm of an experienced ICU veteran settling over my spirit. Reaching down, I set my father's restored, ribbon-wrapped wristwatch gently onto the gift table among the other white boxes. "Then today is the last time you will ever see me as family," I replied, in a quiet, unshakable tone that carried total finality. Turning on my heel with my spine completely straight, I walked back toward my car across the crunching gravel path, leaving the whispering crowd behind without casting a single backward glance, holding my personal dignity intact as I stepped away from her toxic orbit forever into the bright afternoon sun. Driving 20 minutes down Route 33 with my hands gripped firmly at 10 and 2 like a student driver, I eventually pulled my sedan onto the gravel shoulder because the asphalt ahead had begun to swim behind a veil of silent tears. With the engine idling softly beneath the June sky, I did what I had been trained to do through a decade of critical trauma care. I triaged my own emotional wound. Airway, breathing, circulation. Physically, I was intact. Emotionally, my entire past was burning to ashes. Reaching for the oldest, most familiar anesthetic I possessed, I dialed my hospital unit and asked the charge nurse if she needed an extra pair of experienced hands for the 7 o'clock night shift. When she expressed surprise that I was skipping my sister's wedding, I simply replied that my plans had changed, hanging up before any grief could creep into my voice. Sitting alone on the shoulder of the highway in my pale blue dress, a profound realization washed over my spirit. My 12 years of silent, invisible financial support had never been born from weakness or naivety. It had been an intentional, fierce strategy of maternal protection to ensure Chloe never lost the ground beneath her feet during her formative years. My mother had spent a decade labeling me as cold, distant, and absent. Yet, sitting quietly in that car, I understood that real love does not require a public receipt to be authentic, whole, and load-bearing in this world. To understand how I had arrived at that roadside shoulder in a wedding dress I wasn't allowed to wear, I had to travel back 12 years to the dark Tuesday when my father died of a sudden stroke at 51 in the hardware store parking lot where he had worked for 2 decades. I was 22, just 1 semester away from finishing nursing school, while my sister Chloe was a fragile 15, and our mother was 49. Within 24 hours of his passing, our kitchen in Millbrook resembled a casserole convention as the ladies of First Baptist arrived in shifting turns, bringing foil pans and whispering in soft, pitying tones that treated my mother like fragile church glass. While Chloe slept exhausted on the sofa in her black dress, I compulsively washed dishes just to give my trembling hands a job. On the 3rd evening following the funeral, while sorting a stack of condolence cards from the mailbox, I overheard 2 women from the church flower committee whispering low in our hallway. "That poor woman," one murmured softly. 2 young girls, no pension to speak of, and a lapsed insurance policy. She'll lose that house by Easter. Standing there, holding other people's sympathy, I felt the very floor of our family tilt beneath my feet. Later that night, buried among the mail, I discovered a red-stamped notice from Millbrook Savings. Our mortgage was already 2 months overdue, revealing that my quiet father had been drowning in debt long before his heart finally gave out. 2 nights after the funeral, at 2 a.m, I walked downstairs for a glass of water and found my mother sitting directly on the cold linoleum kitchen floor, dressed in her bathrobe, with unpaid bills spread around her like fallen autumn leaves. She was weeping in complete silence, one hand pressed tightly over her mouth in the desperate manner of someone who believed nobody was permitted to hear her break. I had never seen my mother as anything less than an indomitable general who ran church bake sales with absolute authority. But here she was, crushed beneath the weight of impending poverty. Sitting down on the floor beside her, I placed the red-stamped overdue notice onto her lap, so she would know she was no longer carrying the crushing secret alone. For a fleeting second, her face was purely human. Frightened, exhausted, and raw. But then her grip tightened violently around my wrist, a fierce, desperate light returning to her eyes. "Chloe cannot know about this, Wendy," she demanded, her voice an urgent whisper. "Not a word. Ever. She just lost her father. She is not going to lose the home beneath her feet, too." "I can help, Mom," I promised instantly. "In 6 months, I'll be a registered nurse, and we can pay this together." "Then help." She squeezed my wrist harder. "But some help only helps if it is invisible." Intending to protect my little sister's childhood, I accepted her solemn vow, unaware that I was signing away 12 years of my own life. I graduated in May, passed my nursing board exams in June, and immediately accepted a grueling night shift ICU position at Riverside Memorial Hospital in Columbus, 90 minutes away from Millbrook. I deliberately chose the demanding night rotation because the shift differential offered a significantly higher paycheck, and I needed every single dollar I could earn to keep our family floating above financial ruin. By August, the invisible financial engine was operating with mechanical precision. Every payday, an automated bank transfer moved 40% of my hard-earned salary directly out of my checking account and landed into my mother's, framed under the comforting, noble title of Dad's Estate Fund. My mother fiercely insisted that all money flow exclusively through her hands, claiming that if checks appeared bearing my name, Chloe would feel like a pitiable charity case rather than a cherished, secure daughter. It sounded almost reasonable, as her persuasive arguments always did, wrapped in the protective guise of maternal wisdom. So under my mother's name, the overdue mortgage was brought current, the rusted basement furnace was replaced, and the home's leaking roof was completely repaired. I worked 3 grueling 12-hour night shifts a week, regularly picking up a 4th overtime shift, learning to sleep at high noon with a dark towel draped over my exhausted eyes. At 23 years old, I was tired in a quiet, bone-deep way that felt like noble virtue, convincing myself that my physical exhaustion was a small, necessary price to pay, so long as my sister's world remained stable and filled with peace. That first emotional Thanksgiving after my father passed away, I drove home straight after a grueling 12-hour night shift, bringing a sweet grocery store pie and sitting at our old oak dining table. My mother stood up before the feast to say grace, her voice trembling with calculated, theatrical emotion as she gently folded her hands over her champagne-colored cardigan. She thanked God for carrying our grieving family through the dark valley of sorrow. And then she smiled warmly at the entire table, at Chloe, at my Aunt Renee, and at our gathered relatives, announcing that my father's life insurance payout had finally cleared. "We're going to be completely all right," my mother declared with radiant, pious grace. "God truly provides for the faithful." I sat there in stunned, breathless silence, clutching a silver fork, watching my own blood, sweat, missed sleep, and hard-earned ICU salary baptized under the phantom name of a non-existent insurance policy. There was no life insurance payout. There was only a lapsed policy an unpaid premium notice, and a 23-year-old daughter working back-to-back night shifts in a crowded hospital ward. Yet, I swallowed my pride, swallowed my truth, and remained utterly silent. I foolishly convinced myself that it did not matter who received the public credit, as long as Chloe kept her footing and continued her childhood without the suffocating shadow of poverty. That single, self-sacrificing sentence of silence would cost me far more than the mortgage ever could, slowly erasing my presence from my own family's history forever as the years marched on. Over the next several years, my invisible financial sacrifices expanded to cover every major milestone of Chloe's youth, routing every single dollar through my mother's bank account. I paid for Chloe's orthodontic braces, her summer graphic design camp, and the non-refundable deposit for her high school senior trip, all wearing my mother's name like a borrowed coat. Meanwhile, the relentless, uncompromising demands of the ICU night shift took their inevitable toll on my physical presence in her life. I missed Chloe's spring choir concert because I was holding the trembling hand of a dying stranger at 4 a.m, watching his heart monitor flatline. I missed her 16th birthday dinner because 2 nurses called out sick, and a critical care unit cannot run empty. Each time I called to apologize and mailed gifts, my mother's toxic narrative arrived home long before my apology did. She subtly whispered to Chloe that Wendy was far too busy with her glamorous big city hospital life to care about small-town family traditions. Chloe's text messages to me grew shorter, colder, and politer over time. A heartbreaking emotional distance forming between 2 sisters who had once been inseparable. She wore the shining braces I paid for in every school photograph, yet with each passing year, she looked at my face with growing unfamiliarity. I was not losing my sister to time or physical distance. I was losing her to an author who was cooking Sunday dinner in the very house I was paying for every single month. The only time I ever attempted to shatter the invisible cage occurred during Chloe's senior year of high school, when she called me stressed over complex financial aid forms for college. Feeling the crushing weight of years of hidden labor, I took a deep breath and began softly. Chloe, if you ever wonder how your college tuition will actually be paid. But before I could finish my sentence, the atmospheric tone in the room shifted abruptly. My mother had walked into Chloe's bedroom and put the call on speakerphone, forcing me into cheerful small talk. My mother called me back privately that evening, her voice like thick sugar wrapped tightly around a sharp razor blade. "What exactly were you about to do, Wendy?" she hissed softly. When I argued that Chloe was mature enough to know where her blessings came from, my mother delivered the masterstroke of emotional manipulation. "Do you want a receipt for love?" she asked quietly. "Is that who I raised you to be? Because if you tell her now, she will hear that every good thing in her life was just a bill you were keeping track of, breaking her heart 3 months before college." My mother held the ultimate trap because the official bank paper trail agreed with her narrative, and blowing up the story would land destructively on Chloe rather than Carol. Convinced that revealing the truth would cause irreparable emotional damage to my innocent sister, I surrendered, retreating back into the painful sanctuary of absolute, unbroken silence. When Chloe graduated from the State University's prestigious design program 4 years later, I drove down to the arena on 0 hours of sleep following a harrowing Friday night shift. Sitting quietly in the very last row of the packed arena, smelling faintly of harsh hospital soap and antiseptic, I watched my baby sister cross the stage in a cream-colored gown, clapping until my palms burned with fierce, solitary pride. Over 4 years, $38,000 had moved from my account through my mother's hands for tuition, housing, and her design laptop. Down on the main floor, my mother sat surrounded by family, basking in the glow of relatives who praised how the heroic widow had single-handedly put her youngest daughter through college. Afterward, on the sunny lawn, Chloe posed for photos holding a glittered poster board that read, "Thank you, Mom, for everything," while holding the bouquet of fresh lilies I had wired money to purchase. When I approached, Chloe offered me a polite, brief embrace, her eyes already wandering past my shoulder for the official photographer, treating me like a distant family acquaintance, rather than the sister who had financed her entire degree. Moments later, my phone buzzed with an urgent text reporting a critical staffing shortage at the hospital. I offered Chloe a gentle smile, stepped away quietly into the crowd, and drove back toward Columbus before the confetti even hit the ground, realizing that my silence had successfully protected her childhood, but entirely erased my place in her heart forever in this life. 2 years before the wedding, a 61-year-old stranger checked into my ICU unit, a retired print shop owner named Harold Calloway, with silver hair and large, careful hands. He arrived from the cardiac catheterization lab, gray as newsprint, following a massive, crushing heart attack, while his anxious wife stood silently in the doorway all night, with her heavy winter coat still on. On his 3rd night in the critical care ward, around 3 a.m, his bedside cardiac monitor flickered softly, displaying a subtle, easily overlooked irregularity, a tiny run of cardiac arrhythmia that a less vigilant nurse might have charted and walked away from. But 12 years of demanding night shifts had taught me to read a digital monitor the way other people read a human face, detecting the quiet tremor before a catastrophic crash. I immediately called the resident physician, pushed for urgent lab work, and positioned the emergency crash cart directly outside his glass door long before the primary alarm ever fired. When his heart suddenly stopped seconds later, our medical team was instantly prepared, resuscitating him within seconds. Afterward, awake, exhausted, and embarrassed, in the vulnerable way strong men often get, he watched me reset his intravenous lines and murmured softly, "You were standing right there at 3 a.m. You were just there." I offered him a soft smile, replying that it was simply my job. But he shook his head with quiet conviction. No, the night shift is when you find out who stays in this world. For 6 more nights in the unit, Harold called me the one who stays and introduced me to his visiting family with genuine reverence, though my official hospital badge displayed only my first name, Wendy, in accordance with strict staff safety policies. Following his full recovery, my critical intervention earned me the hospital's prestigious Daisy Award for extraordinary, compassionate nursing care. A gold pin I quietly pinned to my scrubs. Grateful for his life, Harold's family mailed a heartfelt thank you letter addressed simply to Wendy, ICU night nurse, enclosing a personal donation to the nursing fund. However, because hospital policy strictly prohibited forwarding mail lacking a full surname, the letter was stamped returned to sender and sent back to his home address, leaving him unaware of my last name. Unbeknownst to either of us at the time, fate was weaving a mysterious, invisible thread between our lives. Harold went home on a gurney ride, while I slept in my dark apartment with a towel draped over my eyes, carrying my quiet award back to my solitary routine. He told his family that he owed a lifelong debt to the guardian angel nurse who had watched over his heart in the darkest hour of the night, filing her memory away in his mind as a symbol of pure, selfless devotion, completely unaware that 2 years later, he would stand up in a sunlit garden and stop a wedding on her behalf in front of 120 guests. 18 months before the wedding, my sister Chloe got engaged to a brilliant civil engineer named Eric Calloway, sharing her pure, unguarded joy on the family group text with a glowing ring photograph. I sent her a sweet private message offering to help with planning, dress hunting, or spreadsheets, but my mother swiftly intervened on the main thread, assuring everyone that their little team had everything under control. 2 weeks later, my mother called my personal phone using the soft, breathless, manipulative voice she saved exclusively for desperate favors, the exact tone from the kitchen floor 12 years prior. "Wendy, honey, there is one last thing, and then we are completely square," she whispered, claiming that Chloe had fallen deeply in love with the Arbor House, a breathtaking garden estate outside Columbus. A Saturday in June had suddenly opened up due to a late cancellation, requiring a non-refundable $7,000 deposit within 48 hours to secure the venue. "The insurance money is completely gone," my mother confessed softly. A strange confession regarding money that had never existed, begging me to fund the deposit while keeping Chloe entirely in the dark. "She cannot know, Wendy. She would feel like an indebted charity case at her own wedding. Let her have this one clean, beautiful memory." Hearing my mother needing me once more, I agreed to sing the familiar song of invisible help, failing to recognize the intricate trap arming itself around my life as the wedding date approached rapidly. However, fate introduced an unexpected wrinkle into my mother's grand design of total secrecy. A bank wire transfer of $7,000 would not clear her personal account in time, and the luxury venue strictly required the credit card holder to sign the legal agreement in person. For the first time in 12 years, the Empress of the Invisible needed her hidden daughter to be visible for 1 hour. On my day off, I drove to the Arbor House, meeting the sharp, compassionate coordinator, Bree Hartley, who walked me beneath the sweeping oak trees and presented the white contract folder. "So, you're the big sister," Bree smiled warmly. "Chloe is so lucky." I signed my name everywhere the small yellow flags pointed, legally establishing myself as the official client of record on card ending 4471, while listing my mother merely as the day of contact, at her explicit request, so nobody would bother me at work during hospital shifts. The contract totaled $21,000, covering the initial deposit, spring installments, and the final balance due 2 weeks before the ceremony. I initialed the guest list and modification clauses without reading the fine print closely, putting my legal signature on paper for the very first time. My mother drove home satisfied, believing she had buried the evidence of her financial inadequacy once again, unaware that by forcing me to sign that legal contract, she had unwittingly signed her entire manipulative narrative up for complete demolition in the near future. 8 weeks before the wedding, an elegant, heavy envelope arrived at my apartment containing a hand-addressed invitation written in Chloe's quick designer script with a single line. "Are you coming? Please?" I called her that evening, and we talked for 40 minutes, our longest, most intimate conversation in 6 years, laughing over dress-fitting arguments and signature cocktails. Halfway through the call, Chloe's tone shifted like a hospital monitor, asking hesitantly, "Did you really tell Mom that weddings aren't your thing?" The entire 12 years of hidden sacrifices surged in my chest as I carefully replied, "There is no version of my life where I would miss yours." A heavy, working silence settled over the line as Chloe weighed my words against 12 years of our mother's narrative, realizing the stories did not match, before her doorbell rang and the moment dissolved. 3 days before the ceremony, the Arbor House emailed its final operational packet to the client of record, listing my name, Wendy Myers, at the header, with a note that the coordinator would greet the paying client at check-in for final adjustments. My mother opened her day of copy and panicked, realizing that in front of Millbrook society and the Calloway family, a stranger with a clipboard was going to greet her invisible daughter by name as the woman who paid for everything. By sunrise on the wedding morning, my mother took the ultimate risk, deleting my name from the guest list entirely to preserve her fragile lie. On the sunlit morning of the wedding, while the grand estate buzzed with joyous preparation and intricate floral arrangements, my mother walked briskly into the coordinator's office with a practiced, urgent smile. Spotting Bree Hartley behind the desk, my mother casually requested that my name be summarily struck from the official guest list, claiming a sudden, delicate family emergency to keep the head count clean. Bree, accustomed to minor day-of adjustments, initially nodded, but as she drew a sharp line through my name, a cold knot of professional alarm twisted deep in her stomach. Opening the primary vendor folder, Bree's eyes locked onto the binding legal agreement and the initialed modification clauses, stipulating that any alterations affecting the official client of record required explicit written authorization. My mother had verbally commanded the deletion of the very person who had legally contracted and paid $21,000 for the entire event. In the events industry, such unauthorized tampering wasn't merely an awkward social snub. It constituted a severe legal liability that could instantly jeopardize the venue's operating licenses and contracts. Recognizing the ticking legal time bomb, Bree immediately escalated the alarming discrepancy to her office manager, setting off an urgent, quiet search for the groom and his father to resolve the contract crisis before the ceremony music began. My mother believed she had successfully erased me from the premises, entirely unaware that her arbitrary stroke of a pen had just awakened a sleeping legal giant that would soon demolish her entire web of carefully crafted lies. Moments later, as the string trio began playing the prelude for 120 waiting guests, groom Eric Calloway crossed paths with Bree in the courtyard, noticing the pale, troubled expression on her face. When Eric asked if something was amiss, Bree revealed the truth with professional gravity. The guest turned away at the gate that morning was none other than the official client of record who funded the entire venue. Standing beside Eric was his silver-haired father, Harold Calloway, who froze instantly as the name echoed through the quiet courtyard air. Harold's breath caught in his throat as the scattered pieces of a puzzle he had spent 2 long years trying to solve suddenly clicked into place. Wendy Myers, the brilliant, compassionate ICU night nurse who had stood by his bedside at 3 a.m, recognized the subtle arrhythmia of a failing heart and saved his life when the alarms were silent. The woman his family had tried for years to find, to express their eternal gratitude, was the very person this wedding party had heartlessly locked outside the gates. A fierce, righteous fury ignited within Harold's chest, dispelling all polite hesitation and social convention. "Halt the ceremony immediately," Harold commanded with absolute, unshakable authority, stepping past the groom toward the altar. "We are not seating one single guest until we find the woman who paid for every single chair we are sitting on today." The majestic prelude music abruptly sputtered and died in the warm June air, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence that caused 120 guests to begin murmuring in nervous confusion across the green lawn. My mother, seated proudly in the front row of white chairs in her champagne dress, felt her phone vibrating frantically inside her beaded clutch as venue managers tried desperately to reach her. Before she could silence the glowing screen, Bree and Harold escorted her into the private estate office, where my sister Chloe was already standing in her breathtaking ivory wedding gown. My mother turned around with a defensive, sweet smile, but the words died in her throat when she saw the white contract folder resting face up on the mahogany desk, bearing my signature. Chloe looked down at the legal document, then up at our mother, her voice trembling with sheer disbelief, heartbreak, and profound betrayal. "Mom, whose name is on this contract?" she whispered into the quiet room. Before Carol could fabricate another lie, Chloe began methodically pulling apart the carefully constructed illusions of her childhood. The overdue mortgage notice she had found years ago, the fake insurance payout, the hidden university tuition receipts, and the intercepted wedding invitations. Piece by piece, the web of deceit that had governed our family for 12 long years finally collapsed under the unyielding weight of undeniable documentary proof. Caught completely cornered and stripped of every manipulative defense, my mother's polished, indomitable facade finally shattered into dust right before our eyes. Her hands flew to her face, and she wept with a broken, pathetic sound as she confessed the generational curse she had inherited from her own mother, the toxic belief that needing help was an unforgivable, twice-told failure, and that showing vulnerability made a woman worthless in the eyes of society. For a fleeting, fragile moment, even Chloe wavered in her righteous anger, overwhelmed by the tragic humanity of the woman who had raised us. But Carol quickly reached for her old, familiar reflexes, attempting to sweep the truth under the rug by pleading with the room. "You have 120 guests waiting outside, sweetheart," Carol sobbed desperately, her voice cracking. "We simply cannot do this messy scene today." Chloe lifted her chin with a fierce, quiet grace that mirrored my own stance in the hospital wards, looking our mother dead in the eye with absolute resolve. "Then you won't mind if my sister hears you say it," Chloe declared, her voice ringing clear and strong through the quiet office. "Because I am standing right here, and I am not getting married today without my true sister standing right by my side." With wedding dress satin rustling sharply against the floorboards, Chloe turned on her heel, hiked her heavy ivory gown up in both fists, and sprinted out of the estate office toward the parking lot in search of a telephone. Ignoring the staring vendors and the mounting panic of the waiting crowd, she borrowed an office landline from a stunned coordinator and dialed the number of the Blue Line Diner, 20 minutes away, where I sat, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The moment my business-like hospital voice answered, my little sister's voice broke raw and desperate down the line, competing with the faint echo of string music looping in the background. "Wendy, it's me. Please don't hang up," she sobbed through her tears. "Everyone is waiting out here, and I just found out whose name is actually on this wedding." Is everything true? Hearing the heartbreaking tremor in her voice, my first instinct was to slip back into my old protective reflex, to tell her it didn't matter and to go ahead with her marriage. But Chloe cut me off with a fierce, cracking cry that pierced straight through my soul. "Stop protecting everyone! That is how she always won. Every time you went quiet to keep her false peace, she stole another piece of our lives." Sitting alone in that quiet diner booth, listening to my sister weep on her wedding day, I knew the time for hiding in the shadows had finally come to an end. Sitting alone in the quiet vinyl booth of the diner, listening to my younger sister weep uncontrollably over a borrowed telephone line on her wedding day, I stared out the rain-streaked diner window at the simple, welcoming lights of the hospital across the street. The temptation to retreat back into the safe, familiar sanctuary of my ICU night shift, where hands are useful and hearts remain unburdened by complicated family politics, was overwhelming. But as Chloe's desperate plea echoed through the receiver, I realized a profound, life-altering truth. My 12 years of absolute silence had never been an act of pure, protective love. It had merely handed the pen over to a manipulative author, allowing her to write whatever tragic narrative she pleased, while I hid in the shadows. True love does not require self-erasure, nor does it demand that you become invisible just to keep a false peace. Leaving $5 folded neatly beneath my coffee cup and canceling my hospital census request with a steady text message, I stood up from the booth with a deep, resolute breath. Walking out to my car, I gripped the steering wheel with absolute clarity. Knowing I wasn't turning my car around to fight my mother or seek bitter vengeance, I was driving back solely for Chloe, ready to step out of the darkness and into the bright, uncompromising light of truth once and for all in this complex world. When I finally pulled my sedan through the stone gates of the Arbor House estate for the second time that June evening, my legs remembered the gravel path with unshakable certainty. Walking straight to the welcome table, I found Bree Hartley standing alone amidst the lingering wedding chaos, her eyes softening with deep, profound relief the moment she saw me. Without a single word regarding guest lists or seating charts, Bree spun her clipboard around so I could clearly see the fresh page. Right beneath the jagged, cruel line of black ink where my name had been maliciously struck out hours earlier, she had boldly rewritten my name in thick, permanent block letters, underlining it with a firm flourish. "Miss Myers," Bree said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You are officially on the list. I made absolute sure of it myself." Inside the venue office, an intense, breathless silence greeted me as I pushed the door open to find Eric, Harold's wife, Harold, a tearful Chloe, and my mother, whose champagne dress now seemed drained of all its vibrant color. Harold took my hands with genuine reverence, proposing that we immediately march out before the 120 waiting guests and expose every single financial receipt to the crowd. But I shook my head slowly, looking him in the eye with a calm, 3 a.m. hospital composure. "No, Harold," I replied softly. "Do not turn my love into a public receipt or a debt she owes. That has always been her weapon, never mine." Today, before anyone else could speak, the private office door swung open, and my sister Chloe stood framed in the threshold, wearing her breathtaking ivory wedding gown, her face pale and tear-stained, holding something small and gleaming in both hands. It was our late father's old, scratched steel wristwatch, the very family heirloom I had unwrapped and placed upon the gift table hours before my public humiliation. With trembling, delicate fingers, Chloe held it up before me, the tissue paper still clinging slightly to the metallic strap. "You gave me something of his when I needed courage," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated sisterly devotion. "Now I am asking for something of yours. Please, walk me down the aisle." The quiet request hung in the air with the unmistakable weight of absolute finality, stripping away every remaining vestige of our mother's elaborate theatrical control. My mother made a small, pathetic sound of protest, her hands instinctively clutching her beaded clutch. But when she looked into her youngest daughter's unwavering, tear-filled eyes, she recognized with staggering defeat that the vote had already been cast. Chloe turned to her mother with a heartbreaking, gentle grace, speaking the words that sealed the night. "You will be sitting in the front row, Mom. That is where you belong." Then my sister went to the mirror to wipe her tears, because there was, after all, a wonderful wedding to celebrate together today. When the massive wooden doors to the sunlit garden finally swung open, 120 wedding guests turned in breathless anticipation, expecting the traditional bridal entrance. Instead, they beheld a sight that would forever alter the history of our family. A radiant bride gripping the arm of an ICU nurse, wearing a simple, ironed pale blue dress, walking slowly down the vibrant green grass between rows of white chairs, as if they were reclaiming every lost year, step by step. I heard the sudden, sharp intake of collective whispers ripple through the crowd, but I let them murmur, realizing I was entirely done apologizing for my own existence or applying for permission to belong in my family. Halfway down the aisle, we passed the front row, where my mother sat in frozen isolation, her face wet and bare, stripped of her church smile, and looking remarkably like the broken woman I had once comforted on a cold kitchen floor. As we approached the altar, Harold Calloway stood up abruptly from across the aisle, stepped into the path, and gently gestured me into his own vacant seat in the very front row. "Front row is for family," Harold announced in a resonant, unapologetic voice that carried across the entire lawn. I sat down beside him. The string music settled into a peaceful harmony, and my baby sister was married beneath the ancient oaks on grass that love had finally paid for, openly, in full. The wedding reception unfolded with a tender, healing intimacy, keeping the focus entirely on the quiet, genuine moments that matter most in human life before the evening came to a close. After the final dances and the heartfelt toasts, as the estate lights began to twinkle softly through the maple branches, I pulled my mother aside into a quiet corner of the veranda for one final, necessary conversation. She looked small and frail in the evening shadows, no longer protected by the towering architecture of her self-serving stories or the adulation of her church community. I looked down at her with the steady, compassionate voice I used for delivering critical truths during midnight shifts, setting an uncompromising boundary for our future. "Here is what happens now, Mom," I stated clearly, my tone gentle yet unyielding. "You are going to write a complete, unfiltered letter to Chloe before Christmas, confessing every single dollar, every intercepted invitation, and every hidden truth about our past. Every detail, from you to her, or I will do it once, plainly, and never speak of it again." She didn't argue, she didn't offer a clever excuse, and she didn't reach for her razor-sharp sugar. She simply lowered her head and gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. I knew then that healing would be a long, slow journey, built sentence by sentence. But standing beneath the starry night sky, I felt an extraordinary, weightless peace wash over my soul, knowing I was finally the absolute, sovereign master of my own life, forever. During the quiet dinner reception, Harold Calloway walked gracefully over to my table, carrying a soft, creased envelope that was 2 years old, placing it gently beside my dinner plate with a look of profound, unspoken gratitude. On the front, written in his wife's careful handwriting, it was addressed simply to Wendy, ICU night nurse, Riverside Memorial Hospital, stamped in faded red ink with "Return to sender, undeliverable." "This letter finally found its proper address," Harold whispered warmly, patting my hand twice with his large, warm hand, before leaving me alone to read the long-lost words of appreciation in peaceful solitude. Later that evening, as the DJ began playing a sweet, nostalgic song from our childhood that I had secretly requested. Chloe reached for my hands, pulling me out onto the sunlit dance floor, where we laughed against each other's shoulders, letting 12 long years of silent grief dissolve into the comforting music. Before Eric spun her away into the celebrating crowd, my sister and I established a sacred, simple promise sealed with a firm, loving handshake. Every Sunday night, at precisely 7 o'clock, our phones would be on, without agenda, pretense, or judgment, to share our lives directly. We have not missed a single Sunday call since that magical June evening. My mother slipped away from the reception early, an exit the town interpreted as a widowed mother overcome by emotion, but which I recognized as a woman returning home to sit in total silence with her heavy, unpaid emotional debt. In mid-December, 9 days before Christmas, my mother decisively beat the deadline I had established on the veranda, delivering a thick, heavy envelope to Chloe's home, written in her neat, elegant script. Spanning dozens of emotional pages, the letter meticulously detailed every single dollar I had transferred over 12 long years, every diverted invitation, every fake story regarding insurance payouts, and the exact financial mechanics behind the overdue mortgage, college tuition, and venue contract. Sitting on her living room rug, beneath the glowing Christmas tree, Chloe read through the unvarnished ledger of our family's secret history, weeping not with bitterness, but with the profound relief of a truth finally coming home to roost after years of shadow, confusion, and painful distance. For the first time in her adult life, my mother stopped editing her story, laying out the unvarnished facts without self-pity, rationalizations, or defensive excuses. She confessed how her own childhood had been shaped by her mother's rigid, unyielding sentence that a woman needing help was a twice-told failure, and how she had trapped herself within her own pride for decades. By sending that handwritten confession, my mother stripped away the fabricated narrative that had kept two loving sisters apart, giving Chloe the priceless gift of total clarity, while allowing our family's deep emotional wound to begin its long, necessary process of debridement, forgiveness, and genuine spiritual healing in the bright daylight. 2 days later, a duplicate copy of that thick confession letter arrived at my apartment mailbox in Columbus, accompanied by a single handwritten line added at the very bottom of the final page. "You were never invisible to me, Wendy," my mother had written in her trembling script. "I just couldn't afford for anyone else to see you." Reading those quiet, heavy words while standing alone in my kitchen, I did not feel anger, triumph, or a desire for retribution. Instead, I felt a deep, compassionate ache for a woman who had spent her entire life trapped inside a prison of her own making. It was not a conventional apology, but it was an unvarnished X-ray of a human soul. A rare moment of absolute honesty from a mother who had finally stood still long enough to be seen through clearly. I folded the pages carefully, placed them in my wooden desk drawer, and smiled softly into the quiet room. Though I have not yet crossed the threshold of my mother's house in Millbrook, whenever she calls me now, on ordinary weekday evenings to talk about mundane things, I pick up the phone and listen. We are rebuilding our shattered bridge, one true sentence at a time, not as a fragile, unrealistic fairy tale, but as two mature, self-aware women who no longer lie to each other, constructing a new relationship that is authentic, sturdy, load-bearing, and enduring for all the peaceful years ahead. Last month, an elegant package arrived at my apartment from Chloe, containing a beautifully framed photograph taken on her wedding morning before any of the chaotic drama unfolded. It was not a picture of the garden aisle or the altar, but a candid snapshot capturing the gift table beneath the morning sun, focusing on a small ribboned box sitting there patiently like a quiet heartbeat. Our father's restored steel wristwatch. On the back of the frame, written in Chloe's artistic designer print, was a simple message. It was always on the list. I hung the framed photograph on the wall beside my front door, positioned directly next to my official ICU nursing badge. Now, on quiet evenings before I leave my apartment to work the night shift, where strangers trust me with their most terrifying hours, I touch the smooth wooden frame with my fingertips, drawing quiet strength from its silent presence. The silver-haired man in bed 9 was right all those Januaries ago when he observed that the night shift is when you find out who stays. A wedding reveals the very same truth, and eventually, so does a family. The photograph serves as a daily, tangible reminder that despite 12 years of hidden labor, sacrificed recognition, and erased presence, love that is authentic and resilient always finds its way back home in the bright, beautiful daylight. Steering my sedan through the quiet streets toward Riverside Memorial Hospital beneath a peaceful, star-filled evening sky, a profound, weightless smile touches my lips as I prepare to clock in for another night shift. I have learned that while silence can often feel like a gentle form of love, love kept completely silent will inevitably be rewritten as cold absence by whoever holds the pen. For 12 long years, I believed that erasing my own voice was the ultimate sacrifice needed to protect the people I cherished, only to realize that true love never asks you to become an invisible ghost in your own life story. We do not have to hold our breath, shrink our boundaries, or swallow our dignity just to keep a fragile, false peace within a dysfunctional family. If there is one enduring truth you carry from my journey, let it be this: speak the true thing plainly, without converting it into a vengeful weapon, while the people you love are still here to listen. You are not a passive spectator in your own existence, nor are you bound to live inside someone else's cautionary tale. You are the absolute sovereign author of your own story, holding the pen, holding the truth, and holding the irreplaceable keys to your own peace forever in this life.